The aftermath of World War I had left the South American navies in a somewhat intriguing position. The three-way arms race between Brazil, Chile and Argentina had been curtailed, but of the three, Argentina had arguably come out the worst. 2/3 of the destroyers that it had ordered would never appear, whilst over in Chile, although they only got one of the two battleships that they'd ordered, they would eventually get all but one of the destroyers that they'd ordered, with the last one having been lost in action whilst in British service, and instead of the second battleship, they'd received half a dozen relatively modern submarines. An attempt at a South American version of the Washington Treaty collapsed, and with news of the Brazilian and Chilean navies modernising their ships, a two-pronged approach was adopted in the mid-1920s. On the one hand, older Argentine ships would be modernised. On the other, new ships would also need to be acquired. The new build list initially included 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 6 submarines and 2 auxiliaries. For the cruisers, Italy was selected from a range of submissions, and the design that was chosen was a scaled-down version of the Trento-class heavy cruisers, which meant that whatever happened, they would at least look really good. Initially, the design seemed to be a straight scaling down of the Italian ship. The main guns were reduced from 8 inches to 7.5 inches, the secondary battery was cut by 25%, and varying amounts were shaved off the various thicknesses of armour. Speed, though, would be 32 knots, which was about as fast as the Trentos were capable of in operational conditions. However, costs began to rise, and with a much smaller target displacement, it also turned out it simply wasn't possible to have stable and affordable ships with the layout and budget that was available. The order was thus reduced to 2, and the aft superfiring turret was deleted. A number of other changes were made, and the 2 ships were eventually laid down in 1927. Veinticinco de Mayo and Almirante Brown had a standard displacement of 6,800 tons, moving at 32 knots, courtesy of 85,000 shaft horsepower, delivered by 2 screws. The main battery consisted of 3 twin turrets, 2 fore and 1 aft, carrying the 7.5-inch 52 caliber gun, which was an Italian take on the 7.5-inch gun that was used in the British Hawkins class, with some German influence thrown in for good measure. The secondary battery was made up of a dozen 4-inch dual-purpose guns in 6 twin mounts, 3 per side, although interestingly, these guns were the type that were most commonly found on Italian destroyers, as opposed to the 100mm gun that was generally found in the secondary battery of most Italian cruisers. There were also 6 single 40mm medium anti-aircraft guns, which were Italian versions of the early model of British 40mm pom-poms. This completed the gun armament. There were also a pair of triple torpedo launchers, 1 per side, but in another weight-saving attempt, these were fixed to fire broadside. There was also provision for a pair of scout aircraft that would share a single catapult launcher. Armour consisted of a 2.75-inch thick belt, 1-inch thick deck, and 2-inch thick gun turrets, which wasn't so brilliant for a ship with heavy cruiser armament, but it did provide a modicum of protection against destroyers and some light cruisers. Both ships were laid down in 1927, as mentioned, launched in 1929, and commissioned in 1931. It's interesting to compare them to their closest equivalents and contemporaries, the York class, which were about as fast, had 8-inch guns as opposed to 7.5-inch, but only half as many dual-purpose secondaries and only 50 caliber machine guns for their pure anti-aircraft weapons. Conversely, their similar torpedo armament could be trained. Armour was also mixed. The British ship's belt armour was fractionally thicker generally and significantly thicker over the magazines. The deck was likewise marginally thicker, but the turrets were only half as well protected. But the York class also displaced over 1,500 tons more. The Argentine vessels would never see official combat, as Argentina remained ostensibly neutral for most of World War II, although the name ship of the class was attacked and then returned fire while she was on neutrality patrol off of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. At some point in the mid to late 1940s, the 4-inch gun battery was removed and replaced with 6 twin 40mm Bofors, along with the installation of radar and modern fire control equipment. The older 40mm guns were also replaced with 4 single Bofors. But these were only in active service for a little longer, As everyone in South America was buying spare US Brooklyn-class cruisers, the two Argentine ships were relegated to the reserves in the early 1950s by the arrival of the ex-USS Boise and USS Phoenix, which were initially renamed to Nuevo de Julio and 17 de Octubre. The Veinticinco de Mayo and Almirante Brown would then remain in reserve for about a decade before being scrapped in 1962, with Almirante Brown passing her name directly on to a destroyer, which in turn passed the name on to another destroyer, which is still in service today, whilst the name Veinticinco de Mayo saw a rest for most of the 1960s before being reused on the ex-HMS Venerable, ex-Carol Dorman, before that ship was scrapped at the end of the 20th century.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.